You are standing under torchlight that doesn't warm anything. The air is thick with tallow smoke, old sweat, and the sharp tang of damp stone. You can feel the room's attention before you see it. Dozens of eyes arranged like furniture, bodies packed along the walls as if the law itself needs witnesses to breathe. Someone clears their throat, not out of kindness, but to remind you that silence is also a verdict. Your hands hover at your sides, unsure what dignity is allowed to look like. A clerk dips his quill. A priest's ring glints. A woman you barely know adjusts her sleeves as though preparing for a meal. And then a voice, calm, official, announces what you are here to prove. He was not a peasant dragged into punishment. He was a husband with a name worth protecting, a household worth preserving, and a reputation built from 1,000 tiny performances of authority. But reputation is brittle. In the medieval imagination, where bodies carried moral meaning and marriage was never just private, one accusation could snap a life in half. The charge was simple to speak and almost impossible to disprove, that he could not fulfill the duties of a husband. Not in the poetic sense, in the literal one. In a world that treated marriage as a social contract witnessed by God and neighbors alike, impotence was not merely an embarrassment. It was evidence. It was grounds for annulment. It was a stain that could bleed onto heirs, property, alliances, and the family's very future. Later centuries would give this ritual a notorious name, trial by Congress, a courtroom that turned into a bedroom, an inquiry that insisted intimacy could be audited. But the impulse behind it runs deeper than any single decade or kingdom. It's the old paradox that sits at the heart of public morality. If marriage is everyone's business, then the most private act becomes fair game for public inspection. How did a society convince itself that justice could look like this? And what happens to a man when the law decides his body is evidence? Before we go deeper, tell me where you're watching from. Every time I make one of these stories, it still amazes me that the past can travel farther than any army ever did. The room was arranged with the care of a ceremony, not a brawl, not a lynching, a procedure, a staged seriousness that made the humiliation feel inevitable, like weather. The husband stood where they told him to stand, because refusing would be interpreted as confession. His wife sat apart at first, not beside him as a partner, but opposite him as a claimant. There were officials of the court, clergy who carried the weight of doctrine, and women summoned for their expertise. Midwives, matrons, those who knew the body not as a metaphor, but as a practical terrain. The presence of women was framed as decency, as science, as propriety. Yet the decency of it only sharpened the cruelty. The law was not saying, "We want to mock you." The law was saying, "We have standards, and you will be measured." He tried to hold himself the way he held himself in other rooms. Straight spine, controlled expression, the face of someone accustomed to being judged for decisions, not for involuntary failures. But this was not a debate he could win with words. His body would speak, and everyone here had come to interpret it. In the corners, people shifted their weight, craving spectacle while pretending to crave certainty. There's a special kind of hunger that grows in crowds when they're told they are not here to enjoy themselves but to participate in righteousness. It gives permission to stare. The first inspection was always described as clinical. That word, clinical, has a comforting sound. It suggests clean linens, careful hands, a neutral gaze. But in a torchlit hall, clinical meant fingers that were not yours touching places you had never had to surrender to strangers. It meant murmured consultations, not about your health, but about your truthfulness. The midwives spoke in low voices, as if modesty could survive the act of examination. The clerk kept writing. The priest watched, not only for propriety, but for the shape of the husband's shame. And the husband, whatever his rank, felt the terrible inversion. He was not the one giving orders. He was the object on the table. The wife's accusation did not need to be poetic to be lethal. She could claim her marriage was unconsummated, that her husband was unable. that her life had been trapped in a vow that produced no children and no fulfillment of the marital debt. Some women accused out of desperation, trapped in marriages arranged for alliances, enduring years of loneliness, seeking freedom through the only legal crack available. Some accused out of strategy, a family shifting its alliances, a powerful father deciding his daughter deserved a different match. Some accused out of revenge, and sometimes the accusation was true. The story is not clean. That's what makes the ritual so terrifying. It was built to handle ambiguity by crushing someone with certainty. In a medieval world, masculinity was not merely identity. It was function. It was public utility. The ability to produce heirs was tied to inheritance, legitimacy, and the continuity of estates. If a marriage produced no children, whispers began long before courts did. First at the market, then in the chapel, then at family dinners where no one said the word, but everyone felt it vibrating under the plates. A barren marriage was a mystery people believed they were entitled to solve. And the easiest mystery to solve is the one that ends with a single culprit. The wife might be blamed for infertility, but the husband's failure carried a different kind of scandal, not simply biological misfortune, but a perceived collapse of authority. If he could not command his own body, what else could he not command? So when the case reached the court, it arrived already wounded by rumor. The husband walked into the hall, not as a man presumed whole, but as a man under question. And the question was not abstract. It was invasive. It demanded demonstration. Here is the first moral contradiction, the one that makes this ritual feel like a nightmare logic. The church taught that sex belonged inside marriage, governed by modesty, bounded by sin and virtue. Yet the same culture could declare, under the banner of law and sacrament, that the only way to confirm a marriage was to force the couple into an act so exposed it became theater. The system insisted it was protecting marriage by violating it. It insisted it was defending morality by manufacturing an obscenity, and the people who enforced it could still sleep at night because they believed the obscenity belonged not to them, but to the accused. The husband tried to bargain with the room, not with money, but with performance. He invoked his lineage. He invoked his service. He invoked the normal machinery of status, the subtle reminders that he was not to be treated like a common man. Sometimes those reminders worked in other disputes. Here they only sharpened the appetite, because to see a powerful man reduced is a special kind of entertainment, especially when disguised as justice. If the ritual could humble him, it could humble anyone, and that made it thrilling. A physician might be called. A cleric might speak about the duties of spouses. Witnesses might testify, servants who had heard arguments through walls, friends who had seen the husband's behavior, the wife's confessor who hinted at private sorrow without naming it. And always, hovering over everything, was the possibility that none of it would matter, that the law, hungry for certainty, would demand the most brutal proof of all. The second curiosity spike comes from an uncomfortable detail buried in the logic of these trials. The court did not simply ask, "Can he perform?" It often tried to determine whether he could perform specifically with his wife. Because if he could perform with someone else, if he had known mistresses, if there were rumors of affairs, then the problem was not impotence. The problem was incompatibility, enchantment, refusal, or some other story that turned the wife into the obstacle. In other words, the court could transform the husband's failure into the wife's fault with astonishing speed. And that's where the ritual becomes even darker. The wife, seeking freedom, could become the one blamed for being unfit to arouse her husband, as though desire were a duty she had failed to inspire. So the wife sat there, accused and accusing at the same time. If the husband succeeded, she would be trapped in the marriage she was trying to escape and branded a liar. If he failed, she would be freed, yet also marked by the public knowledge that her marriage had been inspected like livestock. Even victory came with a wound. The ritual, as it was whispered about, was not always carried out exactly the same way. Sometimes it remained a threat, the terror of it enough to force settlement, enough to force families to negotiate behind closed doors. Sometimes it was performed with partial privacy, screens, curtains, a smaller group of necessary observers. But necessary was a flexible word in a culture that treated spectacle as instruction. And when the ritual did proceed, the couple were commanded to do the one thing intimacy cannot survive: obey. Imagine what that order does to the body. Desire is not a switch you flip because a clerk says now. The body hears fear before it hears permission. The mind, flooded with panic, becomes a traitor to itself. The husband knew this. Everyone knew this. And yet the law demanded it anyway, as if the very impossibility was part of the test. Because if he failed, the court could say, "We did not condemn him." His own body testified. The husband's wife was brought closer. The room adjusted like an audience settling before a play. The experts positioned themselves so they could see without appearing eager. They spoke in the language of propriety. No vulgar jokes, no open laughter. That restraint was the sharpest blade. It meant the humiliation was sanctioned. He tried to look at his wife and find anything human in her face, a memory of tenderness, a flicker of mercy. But marriage in these moments was not romance. It was litigation. Her eyes might hold grief, or anger, or determination, or nothing at all. And whatever she felt, it would be filtered through the knowledge that she was being watched too. Her body was also being examined, not for performance, but for credibility. The priest might murmur a prayer, not for love, for truth, for lawful outcome. The clerk's quill scratched the page like a small animal. The husband's breath became loud in his own ears. He could feel heat rising in his cheeks, the useless heat of shame, while the air itself remained cold. Sometimes the men failed immediately, not because they were impotent, but because they were human. Sometimes they begged for time. Sometimes they asked for a private chamber. Sometimes they pleaded sickness. And the court, aware of every excuse men use when cornered, measured those pleas with suspicion. The cruelty of the ritual was that it turned normal human responses, fear, stress, revulsion, into evidence of guilt. It was a trap designed to interpret suffering as confession. And then, sometimes the husband succeeded. That success did not look like triumph. It looked like survival. The couple performed the act under conditions engineered to destroy it, and the room absorbed the proof with a kind of grim satisfaction. The law had fed on intimacy and called itself righteous. The husband might leave the hall legally vindicated while still spiritually annihilated, because what had been proven? Not love, not fidelity, only function. The marriage remained intact on paper, but something inside it, something essential, was often shattered beyond repair. If he succeeded, the wife's future narrowed. She would be forced back into a marriage where her attempt to escape had become public scandal. She would be watched more closely. Her words would carry less weight. The community would remember her accusation as a kind of moral stain, even if she had been desperate. And the husband, though cleared, would carry the memory of the room forever. Vindication is not the same as healing. If he failed, the consequences were immediate and sweeping. The marriage could be annulled, which was not merely a divorce but a declaration that the union had never truly existed in the eyes of the church. Property arrangements would be renegotiated. Dowries might be reclaimed or contested. Families would reposition themselves like chess pieces. And the husband, regardless of his actual physical capacity, would be branded. In a society obsessed with lineage, to be declared incapable was to have your future rewritten by other people's pens. Here is the hidden rule, the third curiosity spike, that made these cases even more brutal. The burden of proof was shaped by the assumption that the body must be legible to authority. If the court could not read your body, it would force your body to speak louder. And if your body remained ambiguous, the court would often choose the interpretation that best served social order. Not justice, not compassion. Order. A marriage without heirs threatened property lines. A woman demanding annulment threatened family strategy. A husband accused threatened masculine hierarchy. The law stood in the middle of all of it, pretending neutrality while absorbing the anxieties of the entire society. The people who watched these trials told themselves they were witnessing truth being uncovered. But what they were often witnessing was power being reasserted. The ritual reminded women that their escape routes came with humiliation. It reminded men that their authority rested on fragile flesh. It reminded everyone that the community had a claim on the private lives of others. The courtroom was not simply a place of judgment. It was a theater where society rehearsed what it believed about gender, sin, and control. And then there were the individuals, the ones history rarely names, but whose emotions are the real fuel of the story. A young clerk, for instance, might have entered the hall believing in procedure, believing in the cleanliness of law. He might have left with ink-stained fingers and a stomach that turned each time he remembered what he had written down as evidence. A midwife might have told herself she was protecting the wife from male leering by being present, only to realize she had become part of the machinery that made the leering legitimate. A priest might have believed he was safeguarding sacrament, only to feel later that he had presided over a sacrilege. And the husband, whether guilty, innocent, healthy, sick, would carry the same memory, the sense that his body had been seized by the public. Some men fought back in the only way they could. They tried to flood the court with witnesses testifying to their virility, rumors of lovers, stories of earlier children, crude boasts turned into sworn statements. Think of the desperation in that. A man trying to save his honor by confessing to adultery, because adultery at least proved capability. A man letting strangers discuss his private life in exchange for a chance to avoid being declared less than. The law turned morality into a bargain, and men learned quickly which sins were forgivable when weighed against public shame. Others tried medicine? Not modern medicine. Rituals, tonics, the desperate pharmacy of a world that mixed prayer with physiology. There were herbs, potions, baths, bloodletting, talismans. There were whispers of curses, of witchcraft, of the evil eye. Because when a society cannot tolerate uncertainty, it invents explanations that restore control. If a man failed, it must be because something acted upon him, something external, something that could be blamed, hunted, punished. The husband's humiliation could become the seed of someone else's persecution. Now the story shifts, because it always does, from the spectacle to the aftermath, the part that rarely gets staged. In the days after the trial, the husband might ride home through villages that suddenly felt different. People who once bowed might now hesitate. Servants might avert their eyes, not from respect, but from the awkward knowledge they now carried. The wife might return to her father's house if the marriage was annulled, walking through doors that once celebrated her marriage and now received her as a legal problem. Even if she won freedom, she did not win privacy. Her name would be spoken with a certain tone for years, and somewhere, in an archive or church register, a record would remain. Not a dramatic painting, not a heroic ballad. A line of ink stating that a marriage was annulled due to inability, or that an accusation was dismissed after examination. That is the artifact that survives. Bureaucracy's cold memory of a human collapse. They remembered, they recorded, they could not look away. And the record, meant to settle a legal question, becomes a haunting monument to how far authority was willing to go to make the private public. The legacy of these trial by Congress style rituals is not just the shock value of the act itself. It's the way it exposes a pattern that repeats across centuries. When institutions fear disorder, they tighten their grip on bodies. They turn sexuality into a jurisdiction. They turn shame into a tool. They claim that exposure is purification, that humiliation is necessary for truth. And once a culture accepts that logic, the line between justice and cruelty becomes easy to blur. What makes it linger is the paradox that the ritual never truly solved what it claimed to solve. It could not perfectly distinguish impotence from terror, refusal from stress, illness from hatred, incompatibility from coercion. It produced outcomes, not certainty. It rearranged lives, not truth. And yet it persisted because it served something deeper than fact. It served the need of a society to believe that everything, even desire, could be inspected, evaluated, controlled. In the end, when the torches burned down and the hall emptied, the stones kept their silence. The clerk's ink dried. The witnesses went home and told themselves whatever story let them sleep. And the husband, whether he left legally intact or legally ruined, walked out carrying the same invisible mark, the knowledge that a room full of strangers had demanded proof of his humanity and called it law. The image that remains is not the verdict. It's the posture. A man standing under torchlight, trying to hold himself together while strangers decide what his body means. A marriage reduced to a demonstration. A private act converted into public theater. And the unsettling thought that in that moment, everyone believed they were doing something necessary, something proper, something just. Because the most haunting part is not that it happened. It's that it felt normal to them.